Hi, my name is Sarah and welcome to my channel. I have had the desire to make a BookTube channel for a little while now, ever since I started watching a lot of BookTube last year and getting really caught up in the content that everybody's creating and really finding a way to rediscover my love for adult fantasy. So after watching everyone's really interesting videos for the past year, I thought that it would be a good reading goal and a good personal goal for 2021 to try to put some content out myself and see if this is a hobby that I can stick to and see if this is a way that I can connect with some other people who really love reading. Last year, as for so many people, was a very busy year for me. I was finishing up my medical residency, writing my licensing exam, and doing a lot of studying. And in those pockets of time, those rare pockets of time when I was able to take a 10 or 15 minute break, I found myself frequently turning to BookTube and watching videos about people's favorite fantasy novels, about people's favorite characters, and I was totally hooked. I feel like a lot of the media that I consume right now is from BookTube, and it has really put me in the path of some great modern fantasy authors, which has in turn enriched my life a lot. So it's something that I'm really grateful that I found in 2020. I am a huge lover of fantasy, and when I was a young girl, it was the only thing I read. So I exclusively read mostly adult fantasy. I grew up in a really small town, and the only books that I had access to were the books that my dad had in his own personal library. And he was a big fan of fantasy, and so, that was really the only option that I had. And luckily, I also loved it and read everything basically that he had on his shelves over and over and over as a young kid. As I went on to university, I definitely expanded my reading tastes. I studied English and French literature in my undergraduate degree, and so during those years, I read a lot of classics, a lot of contemporary fiction, a lot of Canadian fiction. I am Canadian. I went to a Canadian university, so most of the curriculum was focused on Canadian fiction. And so I read a lot of that during those 4 years. After undergraduate studies, I went on to medical school, and just because of how busy medical school was between studying and clerkship, practical, hands-on work in the hospital, my reading taste tended towards things that were single volume, easily digestible, really quick to read. It was during that time that I spent a lot of time reading comic books and graphic novels. I still read some contemporary fiction, and I read a lot of young adult fantasy because they tended to be shorter series or smaller books that I could read through really quickly without having to have the big investment that those big epic adult series took. But like I said, last year through BookTube, I was able to go back to my roots and read a lot of really fantastic adult fantasy based on the recommendations that I found from so many of my favorite content creators. And that has really made me want to reach out and make videos of my own. I would love to connect with other people who are reading what's new in fantasy right now, along with still reading some of the other genres that I enjoy. But my main focus, at least for the next year, is to try to catch up on that backlog of modern fantasy that I have kind of pushed to the side for the past 10 to 15 years of my life. So in terms of having a goal for the channel, one of my major goals is to be able to read some of that adult fantasy and be able to share my thoughts about it with all of you. I would also love to be able to go back and revisit some of the classic fantasy that I enjoyed so much, maybe look at it through the lens of a modern reader, maybe compare and contrast it to some of the trends and the tropes and the styles that seem really popular today. A lot of what I've been reading over the last year has been fantastic, but decidedly a departure from the fantasy that I read so much of as a young kid. I do have some personal reading goals for the next year, which include kind of reconnecting with those graphic novels that I really enjoy, maybe reading some more classics, just keeping up to date on contemporary fiction, sprinkling in some nonfiction throughout my reads, and obviously some of the nonfiction that I read is related to the field of medicine that I practice, because I need to keep up to date. No more tests, thankfully, after the last kind of 2 decades in school. But I do still read a bit of medical nonfiction to try to keep up to date on my practice. I don't think I'm going to talk about any number goals, like books, a specific target of books that I want to hit for the year, because the medical world is still very much in flux right now. I have a strange and unpredictable schedule, and it's difficult to know how busy I'm going to be from week to week or month to month, especially given the climate overall right now. So I think I'm just going to try to focus on reading books that bring me joy, books that will spark conversation, and books that I hear so many people recommend and have such wonderful things to say about. Aside from keeping up on some of those modern fantasy novels, there are a couple of authors that I would also like to continue to read. So Stephen King is my favorite author of all time. The Dark Tower series is one of my favorite fantasy series of all time. But along with really loving Stephen King, admiring his characterization, enjoying his writing style, I also am not a huge fan of horror, which seems like a bit of an oxymoron, I know, but Stephen King is so much more than a horror writer, as so many people on BookTube know. He is someone who writes brilliant coming-of-age stories. He writes excellent fantasy. He writes crime fiction. He writes all kinds of things, and obviously he's really well known for horror. He is the king of horror. But I think that you can be really widely read in Stephen King, and you can really appreciate him without having read all of his books and without having read all of his scary books. So what I have been trying to do, and what I did last year, is I'm trying to go through some of those books, what I kind of refer to myself as my neglected king, and read some of those really well-known works of horror, because I know that I'll enjoy them. And this was the case last year. So I went back and read Pet Sematary, was one of the ones that I read last year. And I liked it so much, but it scared me so much. I couldn't sleep very well for a couple of nights afterward, and it definitely sat with me like a very unsettling, disturbed feeling for a couple of weeks after I read it, but I'm so glad that I did. And one of his major works, It, I have never read. So that is the next one that is on my list of King reads, but there are a bunch of his horror novels that I haven't gotten to. I own a lot of them, but I haven't yet read them. So that is one of my personal goals for 2021 as well. I would like to read a little more science fiction. I'm not as well read in sci-fi as I am in fantasy. I have read a fair number of classic sci-fi, throughout the years reading classics. Classic sci-fi kind of has gotten lumped in with that. So I have read some of the more well-known classic sci-fi titles. Dune is one major exception to that. So that is a book that I'm really looking forward to reading this year. But sci-fi, graphic novels, filling in my neglected king, those are some of the personal goals that I have for this year. And obviously, that will be related to the content that I want to make, because those will be the books that I'm reading. Basically, overall, I just want to find a place in the community, to find some people to discuss books with, to bring some of the things that I loved about old classic fantasy and compare them to some of the things that I'm discovering I really, really like about modern fantasy. I'm hoping that this will be a good creative outlet, that it will be a form of mindfulness that I can carry through 2021, that can help provide some refuge from the very hectic work life that I have. And I'm hoping that it will fill in some of the space that was left behind when I moved from the city in which I did my residency and out into a small rural area where it's been really hard to get to know people just because of the constraints, the social distancing, the difficulties of meeting up right now. I'm hoping that BookTube will help minimize some of that kind of move-induced loneliness, for lack of a better term. But I am really happy to hear from any and all of you, and I'm really looking forward to having the opportunity to make some content to talk about some books, because that's really why we're all here, is because we share a love of reading. I'm just looking forward to joining in on that conversation and chatting with any of you. Bye.